So you have a recent Third Anglo-Dutch War. You've got increasing taxes with lowering prices for the tobacco product. I guess my question would be, was Bacon's Rebellion something that was inevitable, or was it really about these two antagonists of Bacon and Berkeley?
Well, I end my book with that very question. And I think it's a little bit of both. I don't think there was anything inevitable about this conflict turning into a sustained rebellion. I don't think there was anything inevitable about this conflict happening at this particular moment. Most of the things that you just mentioned were long-term trends. Tobacco prices had been declining since the initial boom of the 20s and 30s, 1620s and 1630s. The recent war with the Dutch was not the most recent one. It was not the only recent war with the Dutch. It was the third in a series of three. There had been plenty of border clashes, if we can call it that, with indigenous people from the very beginning of Jamestown's founding. This had really been a critical, central aspect of life in Virginia, was relations, whether peaceful or not, with a lot of different Indian nations. So it's a very complicated situation. We're talking about roughly 50 Indian nations that were in some way connected diplomatically or in terms of trade with Virginia. So that was a constant. The discontent of the labor force, you start to see signs of that in about 1650. The labor force at the time was mostly comprised of indentured servants, not enslaved people, but people who had signed up for a pretty bad bargain of years of their labor for really very little compensation and a very high chance of their dying of one disease or another before they finished. In the early years of the indentured servitude system in the 1620s, 30s, and 40s, people who survived their servitude had a pretty good chance of acquiring some land. After 1650, it became a little harder, not just because the population was growing, not just because the earth doesn't grow, populations do, but also because you start to get big planters engrossing large quantities of land, especially near the Potomac, between the Rappahannock and Potomac rivers, and not really using it. And finally, there just weren't a lot of women at this point still. And so it was really frustrating for a lot of planters, even those who made it through indentured servitude, even those who acquired a few acres of land. They weren't acquiring the best of land, and they weren't really establishing a household that would be appealing to potential marriage partners who, being in the majority, women being very much in the minority, really could pick and choose and didn't have to, go and live in a really undesirable location in poverty in the woods. And so there was a lot of frustration there. But we have to take personalities into account too. Governor Barclay, William Barclay, was old. Now I'm pushing 60. There's nothing wrong with that. He was old and cranky and deaf and proud. He was from a very important family. He had been governor in Virginia by this time for about almost 25 years. He had ridden out a lot of troubles in the past. So he was proud, he was cranky, he was deaf. He was probably hearing things that people weren't actually saying. And he was being challenged by this 29-year-old young relative of his wife, to whom the governor had extended every courtesy. And that young relative of his wife, of course, is Mr. Bacon, Nathaniel Bacon. And personalities do matter. And I think this may not sound super scholarly, but one thing I really learned in writing this book is just what an awful person Nathaniel Bacon was, even by the standards of the day. He wasn't unique in his attitudes towards Indians. This is a violent time in general. This is a time when back in England, people turned out by the thousands to watch a public execution. The populace as a whole was not full of sensitive New Age men, but people looked at Nathaniel Bacon apparently and thought there's something wrong with that man. I didn't, this is a really well documented event. And so I didn't find a lot of new documentation. In fact, I really benefited from the work of Warren Billings, just a wonderful old Virginia hand who had done this amazing job of gathering all of the papers of William Barclay. I think he told me he missed one in his publication, and transcribing them and so forth. So I wasn't, breaking new ground in terms of the sources I found, except one, which turned up at the Virginia Historical Society. And this was the last will and testament of Nathaniel Bacon's father-in-law. And in it, this father-in-law laid out who would get what upon their marriage and so forth. And his daughter Elizabeth would, he said, get, X number of pounds, was a pretty generous sum, upon her marriage to anyone except Nathaniel Bacon, in which case she would get nothing. And famously, Nathaniel Bacon, he must have seen something, because famously Nathaniel Bacon ended up falling afoul of the law, and he was accused of trying to defraud an orphan 16-year-old boy who had inherited an estate near the Bacons, and basically had to leave town. His father thought that Nathaniel was in enough trouble that he thought, well, I remember that Nathaniel likes to travel. So he put Nathaniel on a boat with 1,700 pounds sterling, quite a large sum of money to get started. And that enabled Bacon to make it to Virginia, leverage some of his influence with the governor and his wife, Frances Barclay, and voila, he's a big landowner near the Curls, near today's modern Richmond International Airport.
So I want to keep going with Bacon here for a moment. Your description of the events with the Okanichi were particularly shocking to me. I don't know why I'm still shocked by the violence of the time, but as you said, he really was an exceptionally violent character, wasn't he?
He was. It's not that Governor Barclay and his loyalists were friends to the Indians. They were discriminating, though. So Governor Barclay, I think it's fair to say that Governor Barclay had genocide on his mind. I mean, that wasn't a word, it wasn't a concept, but he did have in mind that Native people would disappear from his Virginia, but not right away. And not through means that would require raising taxes, and not through means that would upset existing military diplomatic alliances with different First Nations that were useful to Virginia, not that would upset trading partners. He really was willing to discriminate between friends and enemies. And Bacon and his men were not. They were quite clear about this. They complained, why are you drawing all these distinctions? Away with all these distinctions, he wrote. And so it really was shocking at the time that Bacon would take a group of volunteers against express orders from the governor and go down to near modern-day Danville and attack the Okanichis, because the Okanichis were very important trading partners of a number of Virginians, including, weirdly, Bacon himself, who had been involved in the Indian trade down into the southern Piedmont, mostly in deerskins, but also to a certain extent in enslaved Native Americans. And the brutality of this attack, which John, I think you're right, it is shocking. It's a surprise attack from within against an ally, and it just pretty much wipes out the Okanichi Nation, over 100 people all at once. And it doesn't completely wipe them out. They moved to another location near today's Carrboro, North Carolina, but really they were never the same. They had been sort of a powerful Indian nation because they occupied this location, strategic location upon this north-south trading route, and they were just dislodged from that. But who benefited from that? Certainly not Virginia traders, certainly not Virginia taxpayers, who then would have to finance a general war against all the different Indian nations.